Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Derek Pratt. I'm the Director of Education here at the Erie Canal Museum. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you as well to the Winifred and Villo Sloan Family Fund for supporting all of our talks this year. Thank you as well to the New York State Canal Corporation for supporting our 2024 Artist in Residence program. I'd like to acknowledge that the Erie Canal Museum is itself located on the homeland of the Onondaga Nation, central firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and that the Erie Canal is located on the homelands of all members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk, Oneida, Tuscarora, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca Nations. We recognize that the Erie Canal played a major role in the devastation of their traditional ways of living, negative effects of which linger to this day. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, we are committed to taking actions as best we can to do our part in addressing these wrongs through education and inclusion, including through efforts like our partnership with the Scano Great Log Peace Center, reinterpretation of our exhibits, and public programs offering important first steps in that process. So, the impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, politically, and artistically. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, our mission is to engage the public in this story of the Erie Canal's transformative impacts on peoples and places in the past, present, and future. One such area where the Erie Canal contributed to these transformations was in the development of what is known as the Burned Over District, which in turn spawned and expanded a number of new religious movements. This lecture is the final deeper dive of 2024 and is in fact our final deeper dive. More on that in 1 second. We have one more lecture this year as well, our lunchtime lecture on December 19th at noon, featuring the Erie Canal Museum staff. So we're definitely not going to get stuck in traffic or anything. And we'll be discussing some of our favorite objects in the collection and the larger canal stories that they tell. Then comes the big year, 2025, the Erie Canal's bicentennial. And as part of that, we'll continue to provide you with top-of-the-line speakers, but our lunchtime lectures and deeper dive series will be combined into one single series. I highly recommend considering signing up for an annual pass, since you won't want to miss any of our speakers next year. And if you sign up this month, you'll get all of our recordings from this previous year as well. Including our opening lecture of the year on January 15th, which will feature New York City Book Award winner Hugh Ryan, who will be discussing how the Erie Canal helped develop Brooklyn's queer community. So it should be interesting. But now on to today's main event. Clara Riedlinger is a filmmaker, photographer, and ballad singer from Rochester, New York. Her work primarily focuses on the question of American identity using documentary photography and experiential video that bridges fiction and documentary. She also studies old-time fiddle playing and American folklore and storytelling. We've been happy to have her as one of our 3 2024 Erie Canal Artists in Residence in partnership with the New York State Canal Corporation. You can see her work, as well as that of Judith German-Hines and Alon Kopel at the Everson Museum for the exhibit At Water's Edge, Reflections on 200 Years of the Erie Canal, which will open on January 18th and will feature an artist talk in the gallery on February 15th. We hope you can check that out, but in the meantime, check out what Clara has to say.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Hopefully this is worth it. So I actually started this project, or started thinking about this project in 2020. I would say I started taking these really long walks, mostly through Genesee Valley Park in Rochester, where the Genesee River and the Erie Canal cross. And I started thinking about how that landscape in particular had been both designed, in that case, by Frederick Law Olmsted, designing 3 of Rochester's parks. And a major part of his philosophy was a collaboration with the landscape and with nature. So over time, knowing that that landscape would change and develop and appear that it had been naturally occurring that way forever. And I started to have these ideas about the ways that people were interacting with the landscape and viewing the landscape as an active participant in that history. And I'd always been intrigued by the religious and spiritual history of the area. And the more I researched both the landscape and the history of the people here, the more those ideas about religion and spirituality, as well as the economy and political history of the area, all started to come together as one string of intertwined ideas. So this is really where it started. And this image in particular is where I would say the history of both the Erie Canal and of New York State as it stands today, as we all know it, really started. So this is at the Mohawk Gap. This is where the Erie Canal and the Mohawk River flow as one continuous waterway. And at the time, before the canal was built, this would have been maybe in the mid 1700s or so. This was one of only 6 inland waterways that crosses the Appalachian mountain range and allows people to not only move westward through the mountains, but taking this water path allowed them to bring goods and commodities that allowed them to actually populate the area and ultimately create markets where they could sell things and spread many of their ideas. So without the landscape existing in this form that it does, there wouldn't have been a way for people to get into this space other than the indigenous people that were already living here at the time. So I tried to really imagine myself with these photographs being in the headspace of somebody encountering this landscape at the time. What would they have seen? What would they have thought and felt? And just trying to capture both the closed walls of the mountains and these sort of imposing forces, as well as the openness of the water that was going to sort of bring them to what they considered to be salvation from other forms of both persecution, but also many, many wealthy people that were moving into the area hoping to find places where they could make a lot of money, which is ultimately a major motivation for what kind of happened next. So there you can see on the map, that's where the Mohawk Gap is. This is definitely the most eastward photograph that I took as part of this collection. I also want to say directly across the river from this area there is a woman who we now know as Saint Kateri. You'll see her name kind of popping up around the Finger Lakes area, as well as just through upstate New York. There are many Catholic churches and places like that that have her name on them. And she was one of the first white people to have this sort of religious experience. She ended up being taken in by the Mohawk people and lived her life in the Mohawk community, and was later canonized by the Catholic Church. And that would have been very, very early on in the late 1600s. So I wouldn't necessarily consider her part of the burned over district history, but she is kind of the first example of a white settler to have an extreme, or what I would say is an enthusiastic religious experience on this land. That area from the Mohawk Gap to what is known as the Oneida Carrying Place at Wood Creek. This is Wood Creek. That stretch of land was highly contested at the time by white settlers who were often representatives of these larger land purchasing corporations they really wanted to have control of this land that was sacred to the Oneida people. So this is the end of the Mohawk River, which no longer exists because it becomes the Erie Canal. But before the canal was built, the Mohawk River ended approximately 2 miles away from this spot, depending on the season and how the water was flowing. And the Oneidas would carry their goods off the canoes from the Mohawk River, get out, carry everything to Wood Creek, where they would eventually land in Oneida Lake and be able to spread the rest of their goods around. So this idea of an inland navigable waterway was already happening well before anybody had even considered the idea of the Erie Canal. So as people were coming from New England through the Mohawk Gap and seeing the Oneida and the Mohawk people use these waterways, it became very evident to them that this land was going to be essential in connecting those markets on in New England to the Great Lakes, and ultimately winding up with what we would call now the Grand Loop that goes down the Mississippi River, out the Gulf of Mexico, back up to New York City, and then eventually up to the Erie Canal again. So you can sail that whole way today. But this is really the first point where white settlers said we have to connect the Mohawk River to this. And this was the first example of what would later be called manifest destiny. So the idea that God had created the landscape in this particular way so that white people could come in and complete his work in creating this navigable inland waterway. Of course, we have the Oneida Mohawk people and the Onondaga people already recognizing this as spiritual, sacred land to them, often for the same reasons. This water is what provided them fish, lumber, all of the things that they needed to live their lives. So this area became a real hot spot for all kinds of activities. So this is where it is on the map here. So does this have a laser pointer?
Yeah, but it won't show up on the TV.
Oh, okay. Well, so you can, if you can see sort of just east of Albany, and remember where the Mohawk Gap is there, you can see it a little bit in the mountains. And that the Rome Sands Plains unique area, also one of the only inland pine barrens in the country. So there are actually sand dunes there along Wood Creek that you can go see. So I just want to plant these ideas of that there is some strangeness to the landscape here. And I think that also has contributed to its like unique interpretation and experiences that have occurred here. So now at the end of Wood Creek, where the Mohawk River and the Erie Canal and Wood Creek are all one body of water flowing into Oneida Lake, we have now Sylvan Beach, which is this very spooky theme park that is open. You can go, during the summer. I went to it when it was closed for the season, but it was completely open and you could just walk around in it. And it really gave me this sense of, life and death kind of coexisting. There were parts of it that seemed very forgotten and other parts that seemed totally lively and normal. So I really wanted to capture some of that essence. Another way in which these ideas of land use rights and property rights came into play early on was with what is now called Preemption Road. So maybe some of you have driven down Preemption Road that goes all the way from Sodus Bay, straight down the edge of Seneca Lake through Geneva, all the way to Pennsylvania. So it's a very, very long road. And preemption road means that the state had preemptive rights to purchase lands west of that road. So similar to the area around Wood Creek, where people were essentially befriending the Oneida and Mohawk people in particular, and then using those good graces to take advantage of the land use and purchase it on behalf of the state. As early actually as 1750, people had begun clearing out the areas around Wood Creek and building walls along the sides in order to fit larger boats down it. So the story here of Preemption Road is quite similar. This is at the top of Seneca Lake in Geneva now. So there's where you can see Preemption Road. So early on, and the first person that I would consider part of the burned over district history is Jemima Wilkinson, also known as the Public Universal Friend. At the time, Jemima Wilkinson was born in Rhode Island. She became very, very sick to the point where she actually passed away. And then was revived by her doctors. But in that time, in that fevered state, experienced a religious ecstasy. And when she was revived, said, "I am no longer Jemima Wilkinson. I am a genderless expression of God on earth, known as the Public Universal Friend." And she went by the Puff, or the Friend, or the Public Universal Friend following that time. She was driven out of Rhode Island and settled in an area between Penn Yan and Dresden, New York, so right between Seneca and Cayuga Lakes, and started building this mill site, which was the earliest mill west of Seneca Lake at the time. And this line, Preemption Road, had been drawn going up the middle of the lake. So the state currently did not have land use rights for this land. She built the mill along with about 300 other followers, and around 1790, we're told that there had been an accident in the surveying of the land, and that actually she was not allowed to be there and was again driven off of that land. At the time, the 300 approximately people that were living there had to physically move all of their homes, and they had also been trading all of their goods and living in collaboration with the Seneca people that were there, left over after Sullivan's raids just after the Revolution. So a lot of this was politically motivated, and also people did not like that she was saying that she was a representative of God, not only a representative of God on earth, but she literally felt herself to be God, and that was very threatening to their ideas of, who controlled the landscape. But I found it very interesting that this story of, somebody living with the land, really in collaboration with the land, and the sort of legalities of property ownership and land use rights, has continually usurped anyone's attempts to live peacefully in the way that they want to. And when you go to the mill now, you see the ruins as well as these beaver dams, which I think really excellently mirror the Friends community's attempts to create that mill there. So these are some cows that that are nearby there. At the time, the Friends settlement, the Friends community in the Seneca Mill had more cows than people living in their settlement. And so this area, this contested space, approximately 3 miles of surveying accident between Preemption Road and Old Preemption Road, as they called it, is now known as the Gore, which I think is a very violent name for a very beautiful landscape. But this is the Gore in the present day. So around 50 years after Jemima Wilkinson's conversion into the Public Universal Friend, way up in the North Country by Adams, New York, we have the conversion of Charles Grandison Finney, who eventually becomes essentially the founder of what we know today as modern American evangelicalism. So at the time, there were a lot of itinerant preachers traveling through the land prior to the canal, mostly using horse and buggy to travel, so they couldn't get very far. But Charles Finney was a student of one of those people named William Miller, who was kind of the first to say the end is nigh, and I know the exact date that will be at. And Charles Finney has his own conversion after a long bout of intense religious anxiety. He goes out to the woods and is hit with this just burst of intense emotional energy. And he comes up with his own interpretations of biblical text. And at this time, the Erie Canal has just opened. So he begins traveling along the canal and spreading his ideas. So this is a billboard near Adams, New York today that is not a Finney style evangelical church, but it is very similar. It's definitely a descendant of that, I will say. So in the same area, we're still seeing in the present day a lot of these expressions of a particular type of religiosity. So Charles Finney starts traveling along the Erie Canal, as does the family of Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith is about 12 to 14 years old when Charles Finney is in his prime preaching era and using the canal to travel along and give sermons on. And he also is suffering from this intense religious anxiety because there are so many now of these preachers traveling around and hosting these gigantic tent revivals. And they all have slightly different versions of what they believe, and knowing which one is right and which one he is supposed to be following consumes him. And again, he's only about 14 years old at this point when a beam of light comes into his bedroom and gives him instructions to climb the hill Cumorah every year for 5 years, and he will be given the key to decode a series of texts written by angels. So this is his childhood home. The Smith family had just moved from Vermont to Palmyra, New York, so right along the path of the canal here. And at this time, land was very, very cheap. They had not been able to pay debts in Vermont, but they knew that with the canal coming, soon markets would be wide open for them to sell their goods. They were also working as treasure hunters. They would use dowsing rods as well as specific types of stones, seeing stones that they would put inside a dark hat and kind of look at the shapes like you do behind your eyelids when you close your eyes, and use that as a map to find buried treasure. So people would hire them to search their properties, and that's how the Smith family was making money when Joseph Smith first encountered this beam of light. So this is the view driving towards the Hill Cumorah from the Smith family farm, which is not a very close walk. They're about 3 miles apart. And I think that's important to note because it wasn't just a casual walk up a hill at the time. Like this was a concerted effort over an extended period of time. This is inside the house. Again, trying to place myself sort of in the mindset of somebody at the time, thinking about the beam of light as Joseph Smith first described it. And I do want to say, I think a lot of this story in particular is very easy to judge and have our own like moralizing opinions on. But being there and feeling this sense of really overwhelming beauty and awe and trying to put myself in the shoes of people who were living very different lives than I was. I hope that these photographs maybe offer a sense of empathy even to people that we would disagree with. So I really, I wanted to see that beam of light and I kind of felt like I got there, I will say. So this is the Hill Cumorah. Again, effortful to get there on foot, and effortful even to walk up. It's quite steep. And so this is the Hill Cumorah in the present day. At the time, it would have been completely wooded. And I think this image in particular is very interesting because if anyone has been to the Hill Cumorah pageants in the past, this hillside would have been completely cleared with steps built up to a large stage. And they stopped doing the pageants in 2020, which was supposed to be the final one. And then 2019, it turned out was the final one for obvious reasons. So instead of having this massive cleared path with the stage, they're allowing it to regrow and it has been replanted with all native trees and shrubbery so that it will match the old growth forests on either side of it. So this image, again, I think is really interesting because it is in this sort of in-between moment where you can see the past, you can see that those old growth trees, and you can see what it will become in the future, which is just moving back into the past. So I really view a lot of these photographs as a sense of time travel, placing myself back in this era where the landscape would have been just totally all-consuming and powerful. And so to be able to be in this in-between spot where both times are existing at once, I wish I could have photographed the Hill Cumorah pageant for this project, but I actually think this state of the hill is even more representative. So this again is back at the Smith family farm as well as the Sacred Grove where Joseph Smith ultimately presented his translations of the Golden Tablets as the Book of Mormon to 8 elders. And I had to go there many times to get a photograph of it that didn't have people in it making pilgrimages to the site. So here's the top of the Hill Cumorah. So there's this statue of the angel Moroni as Joseph Smith described him. But I'm personally more intrigued by the image on the left, which I think is no less an expression of like awe and wonder and just the way that light hits the leaves on the trees, I think is really magical. Here we have a landscape that would have been seen by both Joseph Smith and the Fox family. So the Fox family was in New York State at the same time as Joseph Smith, though who we know as the Fox sisters now. Primarily Katie and Margaretta would have been very young children at the time that Joseph Smith was a fully grown adult. But this is on the canal path between Palmyra and Newark, New York, which is where Hydesville used to be. Hydesville no longer exists as its own township, but that is where the Fox family settled at the time. Same thing with this image, which I think actually this one probably has changed significantly, but again, just kind of emphasizing the collaboration between man and nature. This looks like a very natural landscape, but is a man-made marsh that goes along the Erie Canalway trail between the canal and our railroad, which is privately owned by the Railroad Corporation, and you have to cross private property to get to the canal from here, which again just kind of was I put a little pin in that when I crossed it because it was this idea of private property and land use and access rights kind of popping up again when I least expected it. So this idea of man and nature collaborating with each other was very much in the air at the time. So if you read different accounts of people traveling along the canalway, you'll see some, like the author Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was like, I hate this, it's so industrial, we never should have touched the landscape, and other people who really found beauty in the natural elements of the land. So as the canal travels through now, this one taken near Lock 32 in Pittsford on the left, you would never know that the canal is not just part of the natural landscape. And it really is its own natural ecology now. But at the time, would have been a rather destructive and rupturing force on this land. The image on the right, taken along the Genesee River in Rochester near the crossing, as well as near the hydroelectric plants at Little Falls Park. And again, I was just really looking for those expressions of this like universal energy or light that would strike me maybe in the same way that it would have people encountering this landscape for the first time. So again, this is also at Little Falls evidence of man and nature sort of collaborating to create these images. So we'll go back now to Charles Grandison Finney. We're still in Rochester, still at this crossing of the Genesee River and the canal, this time closer to the original crossing downtown, where the canal traveled along an aqueduct and went right through the city of Rochester, which made Rochester at the time the largest growing municipal area in the country. This spot, which is now, and actually was at the time also a parking lot, although it would have just been an open lot. But this building, this marble building in the back here, was the site of one of the largest camp meetings at the time during the revival. So in 1843, it wasn't Charles Finney himself, but his publisher representing him was the sort of keystone speaker at this event in Rochester, where over 3,000 people gathered to pray together, both in this lot under a massive tent and filling up this building in the back here, which would later become the home of the North Star Press, Frederick Douglass's press. And I just really was struck by the light hitting that water tower that just kind of said to me, like, this is important, take a picture of this. And later I found out that this was the site of that camp meeting. So you can imagine the sounds of 3,000 people all in ecstasy, praying together, yelling, crying. And these camp meetings are really where speaking in tongues sort of originated, and people translating for each other. And nearby, this maybe a mile or two away from here now is also Charles Grandison Finney High School. So he's very much still a presence in this area. So this is where the canal and the river cross now, where I started this story. In Genesee Valley Park. And again, I just loved the nature reflecting the story here. So the confluence of the two branches along the trunk and the confluence of the river and the canal coming together, I thought mirrored each other in a really wonderful way. And this tree is actually no longer there. This is a cottonwood tree, and they just don't live very long lives. So the landscape is still continuously shifting and changing. And as much as I might attempt to place myself in these scenarios where I can witness the landscape and the spirit of that landscape the way that people would have in the 1800s, it's still essential that I do that with the landscape as it is today. So just a few other things. So this is the Oneida Community Mansion House. We can see it sort of in this print form here. The Oneida community, which we all know from their wonderful silverware, was at the same time that Joseph Smith was developing his ideas about Mormonism, what would become Mormonism and the Church of the Latter-day Saints. The Oneida community were developing their own ideas about really what it meant to live a good life. At the time, there were a handful of utopian societies, some of which were religiously oriented and others which were more politically motivated. But the common thread is that they were all living under communist ideals. And worth noting also that this is approximately 5 years prior to the Communist Manifesto being published. So ideas about how to live a good life and how to live with other people were very much in the air globally. And another bout of religious anxiety drove John Humphrey Noyes to say, well, there are no distinctions between marriage and property in heaven, so we should all live as one family together in this area. They were all married to each other. They shared property as well as children and sexual and romantic partners. Eventually they did sort of maybe I would say take it too far and start deciding who was allowed to have children with each other. But in the meantime, they communally designed this building that really operates as a panopticon for them to all keep tabs on each other and make sure that nobody was essentially hogging time with anybody else because they were all supposed to share it equally. And they would also stand on this stage in this room, which is the Great Hall, and they would take part in a practice called mutual criticism, where someone would stand on stage and they would tell people in the community what they thought was wrong with each other. And the idea that you would use that information to better yourself. So here you can see sort of this panopticon view where you can stand on a balcony and see the other people in the living room area. And prior to them creating silverware, their first step into capitalism was with animal traps. One of the earliest members of the Oneida community happens to be one of the best trap makers in the Northeast at the time. The fur trade was booming throughout the Great Lakes area, and they found a way to mechanize the production of his traps so that they could sell them. This is some private land that I was not allowed to walk on near the Oneida Community House that I just found really, really beautiful and awe-inspiring, even with the electric barbed wire down at the bottom there. So right around this same time that John Humphrey Noyes is developing the business side of the Oneida community, and this is now around 1848 or so. The Fox sisters moved to Rochester, traveling along the Erie Canal, and they move right downtown and give their first public seance right along what at the time was the aqueduct that carried the canal on it. And this building is now a Holiday Inn Express, but it was it was known as Corinthian Hall. Corinthian Hall burned down twice subsequently following that, and after the second time, the city of Rochester chose not to rebuild it. So now it's this Holiday Inn. But this is where the first public spiritualist seance occurred in November of 1848. The spiritualist idea, philosophy took hold, rooted really not only all over the country, but internationally. And this house has a very interesting history to it. A man who was a spiritualist, but didn't necessarily consider himself a medium, received a vision, and he was living near Colgate College too, so right around the same area as the Oneida community, but he was a spiritualist. And he received visions with instructions on how to build a house where humans and departed spirits would live together. So the house was constructed with a series of rooms that have no windows, stairs that go nowhere, many, many closets, which would serve as the spirits' bedrooms, basically. And then there were large conference halls where the idea was people and spirits would have collaborative meetings. And so it's got this very intricate woodwork on it. And it is also privately owned private property, and the woman who owns it really does not like people knowing about its history. She does not want you to go there. I will say, I know that I am allowed to have this photograph because I took it from the street, but she did come out and yell at me. So again, this is across the street from that house. We have this private property, no trespassing sign. And we're back on the right here, back to that Canalway Trail between Palmyra and Macedon, where you have to cross the private property of the railroad company in order to get to the canal. But I thought that these two trees were both just immensely beautiful. So this is on that same part of the Canalway Trail. It's blocked by a different private property. This is actually for a small resort where you can like rent a paddle boat, and there's a small water park there, but you have to walk around it in order to get back to the canal. Which again just makes me think of poor public universal friend Jemima Wilkinson being driven off of her lands several times this is back at the Seneca Mill. So a story that I thought was only ever going to be about religion and spirituality ends up being about private property and land use rights. But they are all very, very deeply intertwined in a way that I maybe had ideas about before, but didn't really deeply understand until I did this project. And this is just this burst of beautiful color along the trail around a brand new nature conservancy in Pittsburgh, which is where I grew up along the canal. And this landscape, again, just going back to its natural kind of wild state, but is a very manufactured and designed space in the nature trail. So I just wanted to end there because this is where the canal started for me, near Lock 32, and I think that this image of this nature park in spring just really contained all of the feelings that I have about it in some way or another. Derek, what time are we?
2:30. So
Okay, perfect. Okay. So is there? Oh, I can't show my film because it's on your computer.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna say then that everybody should come to the Everson to see the film because I don't think I will be able to zoom in on you.
I could also, after the talk, everyone gets the recording. I can send it in an email too.
Yeah, sure. That would be great. But I will open it for questions because I think we have a little bit of time. Yeah.
Not in your nature thing, but I noticed in Seneca Falls of Women's History,
Mhm.
there's one display which credits the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement to the revival era, where the preachers encouraged women to read the Bible.
Yes,
This is
absolutely.
an innovative idea that women could read the Bible and get inspiration.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so that's actually a really interesting point, and I'm never sure how much detail to go into it with each given talk, but yeah, so a major part of these revivals and particularly Charles Finney's interpretation of biblical text was that individual people had, and I mean, this goes all the way back to like Martin Luther, right? Like that individual people have the right and the obligation to read the Bible for themselves and have their own personal relationship with it. And that makes it very difficult for those people to be controlled. And yeah, and so Charles Finney, in his conversion moment, he had other ideas, but that was one of the core tenets of it. And most of his early audience was women. Men had often been conscripted to help build the canal, or they were clearing their lands or farming, or busy doing other things. And the women had this opportunity to get together with each other and also go to these tent revivals. So some of the earliest people experiencing that, what I'm calling ecstatic or enthusiastic religion, many of them were women to start with. It's also where the temperance movement started. So yes, they all converge. And many of the major spiritualists were also major players in the abolitionist movement, especially I would say like the Post family, Isaac and Emily Post, or Isaac and Amy Post, who lived in downtown Rochester and were very, very wealthy and political movers and shakers in Rochester. And Isaac Post was a spiritualist medium. And they funded a lot of the Fox sisters' public seances as well. So it's all very, very intertwined. Yes.
In fact, one of the Fox sisters later came clean, right?
Well, I guess it depends on how you interpret their experiences, whether they came clean or whether she was coerced into recanting. But what happened, yeah, with her, she was, the Fox sisters themselves were very, very poor, and struggled for a long time with depression and anxiety and alcoholism. And one of them, which I'm not remembering at the time whether it was Margaret or Katie, I think it was Margaret, had the opportunity to marry a very, very wealthy politician. And he said, I will only marry you if you recant all of your beliefs and convert to Catholicism. So she did that. Whether that was for financial stability, and to receive help with her problems with alcohol, it's hard to say, or whether she really truly wanted to recant, whether she wanted to get out of the public eye, because they were also suffering significant abuses by people taking advantage of them, as well as non-believers who were often funded by Harry Houdini, who was also very popular at the time, where they would literally be under they were poked and prodded by doctors and scientists and people trying to figure out what they were doing. So I can imagine that suffering all of those things and having someone offer you a lot of money on the condition that you recant might motivate you to recant. Because she then recanted her recanting on her deathbed. I think it's really difficult to say clearly whether it was one way or the other, but I think there are a lot of convenient interpretations for people believing both in both directions.
It one of this girl's big toes, or was that?
Yeah. They said they were tapping their big toes, but I don't know if I just can't imagine cracking my knuckles or my toes loud enough for it to be, because you have to remember they didn't have amplification either. So I'm resisting going one way or the other.
I happened to visit their home site.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, there's nothing left but foundation.
Yeah.
It ain't the Sistine Chapel.
Oh, I know. It's in the film when you all see the film. Yeah, and the actual building has been moved to Lilydale, where the current spiritualist center is. Yeah.
And just one other, the house that is not supposed to be visited, the spiritual house. Just
Yes.
Where is it?
It is in I believe Hamilton County or Hamilton, New York. Georgetown. Yes. It's right near Colgate University. Yeah.
Okay.
Which was also started because of that Wood Creek area was meant initially to be an Indian school, like all the terrible ones that they have been uncovering. And luckily it didn't get enough traction and they never enrolled any students.
Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you.